Have you ever built something with your bare hands only to watch someone you trusted tear it down in minutes? My name is Eli Navarro. For 17 years, I was the quiet force behind Hearthlight Hospitality, a boutique hotel and cafe chain known for its warmth, sustainability, and local ties. I wasn't the one in glossy investor decks or magazine spreads. I didn't host vision retreats or flash hashtags about leadership. I just ran the business. Efficiently, quietly, intentionally. And then, one Friday morning, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the very street where our first cafe once stood, my younger sister Marisa told me my services were no longer required. "You're too operational," she said, in the same tone someone might use to describe a weathered couch. "Hearthlight needs elevation, elegance." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply packed up my things and left the office that I had personally renovated with reclaimed wood and community labor. What she didn't know, what she never thought to ask, was that while she was building a brand, I had been building something else. Something quieter, stronger, and rooted so deep, she'd never be able to touch it. Not when it mattered most. I didn't come from a place of flash. My mother, Lillian Navarro, was a self-taught entrepreneur who started Hearthlight as a single storefront cafe in the Bywater district of New Orleans. She believed in spaces that felt lived in, not staged. Mismatched mugs, reclaimed furniture, fair-wage jobs. That was her idea of luxury. And somehow it worked. Locals came for the coffee, stayed for the warmth, and word spread. Over time, that little cafe turned into a chain of small boutique hotels with attached cafes in cities like Charleston, Austin, and Asheville. Each location reflected the local character. No two were alike, but every one of them had soul. Marisa. And I grew up in the business. She was always more polished, more outward-facing. I don't say that with resentment. She genuinely had a gift for branding and presentation. She could sell a story before the product even existed. While I was fine troubleshooting HVAC systems at 6 a.m. or sitting through staff conflict mediations, she was at networking breakfasts or filming day-in-the-life content for our social feeds. When our mother stepped back 5 years ago, she split the roles. Marisa became Chief Brand Officer. I was named Chief Operating Officer. At the time, it worked. Our strengths complemented each other. I handled logistics, operations, hiring, vendor relations, and compliance. She attracted attention, secured partnerships, and developed investor relationships. We weren't best friends, but we didn't clash either. Not openly. There were small signs, of course. Marisa would override hiring decisions without discussion. She'd send glossy design renderings for new locations that had no consideration for actual functionality. Sometimes she'd say things like, "We need to be aspirational, not accessible." I would quietly reverse those moves before they reached implementation. But our mother, ever the peacekeeper, kept us balanced. She chaired board meetings, maintained veto rights, and reminded us that Hearthlight was about values first. Then, last spring, without warning, she announced her retirement. "It's time," she said over brunch one Sunday. "You two will take it from here." Her shares, along with her voting seat, were transferred into a non-voting trust for her eventual grandkids. With no real succession plan in place, the board leaned toward the younger, more public-facing sibling, Marisa. She was named CEO by unanimous vote. I congratulated her. I meant it too. I thought we'd continue working together with her leading the brand and me keeping the engine running. But things changed fast. Within days, she brought in her executive coach as a business clarity consultant. Staff meetings were replaced with video trainings. Personalized welcome baskets for guests were replaced with QR codes. Our longtime linen supplier was dropped for a cheaper alternative that used synthetic blends. She called it innovation. I called it forgetting who we were. 3 weeks after her appointment, I was called in for a brief strategy alignment conversation. The consultant was there. So was legal counsel. The message was simple. "It's time Hearthlight evolved," Marisa said, "and that means making space for new energy." I was out. But she had no idea what I'd built beneath her feet. I didn't make a scene when they asked me to leave. That would have been her style. Dramatic exits, cutting one-liners, a carefully composed Instagram post about leadership transitions. I signed the paperwork, boxed up my office, and quietly shook hands with the receptionist I'd hired 12 years earlier. No speech, no tears. Just silence. The official narrative was that I was taking a sabbatical to explore other ventures, a phrase Marisa used during the next board update. She even smiled when she said it, as though it were a favor. My keycard access was revoked by the end of that day. The final HR email thanked me for my years of dedicated service. It was signed by someone I'd trained last summer. Still, I left without bitterness. Not because it didn't hurt, it did, but because I already knew what she didn't. She thought I was just another operator, replaceable, functional, the kind of person you thank in passing before making strategic moves. What she never understood was that running Hearthlight wasn't just about metrics or margins. It was about rhythm, about people and timing and texture, about the small details that never make it into the pitch decks. You don't learn that in business school or during visioning retreats in the Berkshires. I drove home in silence that evening, past the first Hearthlight cafe, which now sat beneath a rooftop garden I'd personally designed, past the supplier warehouse where I knew the names of every dock worker. At a red light, I watched a delivery truck pull into the Austin location, which had won an award 2 years ago for sustainable design. Marisa had accepted that award on behalf of the company, but I was the one who'd figured out how to make solar integration work under budget. I thought about calling our mother, but didn't. She had made her choice. I didn't blame her. Maybe she thought we'd work it out. But Hearthlight had changed. It wasn't about legacy anymore. Not in Marisa's eyes. It was a brand now. Something to scale, to license, to franchise. She used to talk about hospitality as a human experience. Now she said things like vertical integration and luxury repositioning. I realized in that moment that her vision didn't just exclude me. It betrayed everything we'd once shared. The first week out, I tried to stay busy. I read books I'd been meaning to get to, cleaned my home office, caught up with old friends. But there was still a constant ache, not just from the betrayal, but from knowing how quickly she was dismantling the culture we'd spent years building. I started hearing things, quiet texts from old managers, suppliers reaching out for clarification, emails from confused staff about new protocols that made no sense. I didn't respond to any of them. Not yet, because while Marisa was reorganizing staff structures and rebranding websites, I was opening a locked file cabinet in my house. Inside were deeds, contracts, and leases. Quiet documents that told a different story. One that had been written in parallel for years. She thought she'd pushed me out. What she didn't realize was that she'd just cleared the path. It started with a single conversation over 10 years ago, one I'd replay in my mind more times than I could count. My mother and I were walking through the New Orleans flagship after a late-night staff meeting. The place was quiet, the scent of brewed chicory still lingering in the air, when she stopped at the entrance, looked up at the exposed brick walls and said, "Eli, never mistake operating something for owning it. Titles can be taken, land can't." I didn't understand it then, at least not fully. I was focused on fixing plumbing schedules and staff turnover, but over time, the meaning settled into place. Hearthlight was growing, yes, but most of our properties were built on leased land. Prime lots in gentrifying neighborhoods, owned by people who'd held those parcels for generations. I'd been the one to renegotiate many of those leases. I knew their expiration dates, their clauses, their vulnerabilities, and quietly, deliberately, I started making offers. I created a separate holding company, Rising Ground LLC. It had no visible ties to me, registered through a blind trust. Over the next 5 years, it acquired the land beneath 3 of our most profitable properties, the Austin Cafe Hotel Hybrid, the Charleston Waterfront Inn, and the original New Orleans flagship. These weren't impulsive buys. Each took months of conversations, discreet financing, and careful legal structuring. Some owners were older and ready to sell. Others agreed to favorable terms in exchange for rising ground maintaining local preservation codes. I honored every agreement. The company continued to lease the properties to Hearthlight at a modest, below-market rate. I wasn't interested in bleeding the business. I believed in what we'd built. At the time, Marisa was too distracted by national press coverage and influencer partnerships to notice a change in ownership. She signed the lease renewals without reading the full appendices. She was focused on photo ops, not land rights. What mattered was that I owned the ground, and with every passing month that ground appreciated, especially in cities like Charleston and Austin, where developers circled like hawks. But I didn't flip the properties. I held them. I waited. When I was forced out of Hearthlight, the timing wasn't convenient, but it was not disastrous either. The leases on all 3 locations were set to expire in just under 4 months. Each contract included a renewal clause that required landlord approval, and each clause had been written by my attorney, who ensured that the terms were legally airtight. I sat at my kitchen table one morning. The stack of documents spread out before me. Every page was in order. Every signature accounted for. What Marisa had dismissed as boring logistics was in fact the foundation of our company, and she had no idea that foundation now belonged to me. The real beauty of it wasn't just the ownership. It was how little she had bothered to notice. She thought the Hearthlight brand was everything. But without those 3 properties, our highest grossing, most recognizable, and most historically protected locations, the brand was just a logo on a website. I didn't need to shout or threaten or litigate. All I had to do was wait. Because in a few short weeks, Hearthlight would come back to the table, lease renewals in hand. And for the first time, Marisa would realize she wasn't the one setting the terms. I didn't have to wait long for the cracks to show. Within 6 weeks of my departure, the first emails trickled in. Former staff reaching out, cautiously at first, unsure if it was even appropriate. A guest experience coordinator from Charleston said the new linen vendor's products were causing complaints. A longtime cafe manager from Austin mentioned sudden schedule changes, shorter shifts, and strange efficiency audits being done by someone who had never worked a day in hospitality. Marisa had moved quickly, too quickly. She rolled out a streamlined guest experience initiative across all locations, replacing our warm check-in rituals with self-service kiosks. Staff uniforms were updated to sleek minimalist outfits that looked more at home in a tech startup than a hospitality space. Our local vendors, coffee roasters, soap makers, farmers, were dropped for national suppliers that could undercut prices but brought no soul. In a Slack message forwarded to me by a former operations lead, her new consultant had written, "We're not running a charity, we're building a brand with margins." The result was exactly what I expected. Staff morale plummeted. The sense of ownership and pride that had defined Hearthlight was being vacuumed out of the rooms. Reviews on travel platforms turned sour. People weren't just disappointed, they felt betrayed. One particularly pointed comment on the New Orleans location read, "This used to feel like home. Now it's just another overpriced boutique hotel, pretending to care." That one stayed with me. Still, I didn't step in. I watched. I listened. When a friend from the Charleston Chamber of Commerce asked me if I'd heard about the recent staff walkout, I just said I'd read something about it online. When a barista I had mentored from high school sent me a voice note, just the sound of her crying quietly and saying, "It's not the same without you," I didn't reply, not because I didn't care, but because I knew that if I did, I'd get pulled back in before the timing was right. Then came the maintenance issues. In a place like Charleston, you don't ignore coastal humidity. HVAC systems need near-constant monitoring. At Hearthlight, I used to run a quarterly inspection schedule personally. Now, with new maintenance contracts designed to cut costs, the building started showing strain. Mold reports surfaced. Guests noticed odd smells. One unit had a minor electrical fire due to deferred inspections. Local news picked it up. The brand image, Marisa's prized crown jewel, was slipping, and still, no one at Hearthlight seemed to know why it was happening. They thought the turbulence was part of Transitional growth. What they didn't realize was that their foundation, both literal and cultural, was gone. The culture had walked out with me, and the foundation? It sat quietly beneath their feet, waiting for its terms to change. The countdown had begun. 3 leases, 42 days, and not one person had called me. Not yet, but I knew they would, because brands can be rebranded, buildings can be repaired, but the land, well, the land always has the last word. The call didn't come from Marisa. It came from a junior associate in Hearthlight's legal department, a new hire, judging by the nervous tone. He asked, somewhat awkwardly, if Rising Ground LLC would be open to an early conversation regarding the terms of our upcoming lease renewals. I gave him the kind of pause that makes a person sweat. Then I told him to submit the request formally, in writing, to my attorney. It's standard procedure, I said. He thanked me and hung up a little too quickly. 2 days later, a formal letter arrived. It was polite but vague, asking for a collaborative discussion about revised terms and possible multi-year extensions. Buried in the language was the real concern. They needed stability. Hearthlight's internal forecasts were likely already showing what I knew. Without those 3 properties secured, the brand was structurally unstable. Each location represented nearly a quarter of their total revenue. If those leases didn't renew, the business wouldn't just take a hit, it would stagger. I passed the letter to Patricia, my attorney, and asked her to begin drafting counterterms. Market rate, I told her. Strict oversight clauses. Monthly inspections, no subletting. She raised an eyebrow. You're turning the screws. I shook my head. I'm just enforcing what they ignored. But then something changed. Patricia called 3 days later, her voice sharper than usual. They filed a discovery request, she said, claiming a potential conflict of interest in your previous executive role. They're trying to argue the original lease agreements were signed under questionable circumstances. In other words, Marisa was preparing for a legal challenge, an attempt to either void the leases or at least stall the renewal negotiations. It was bold and sloppy, because what they hadn't realized was that I'd anticipated this years ago. Every lease had been reviewed independently. Every document was signed by proper board representatives. The LLC's structure was completely separate from my executive title. I'd even recused myself from discussions related to property planning during my final year as COO. My hands were clean. But now I knew one thing for certain. Marisa was desperate. That suspicion was confirmed when I got an anonymous email from a current employee. No name, no signature, just screenshots. Meeting minutes from an off-site retreat, presentation slides labeled Project Ember, and a list of future locations, all remarkably close to existing Hearthlight properties. I recognized the name immediately, Ember House. I'd seen the LLC buried in the city planning records during a routine scan months ago, registered to Marisa under her married name. She wasn't just trying to salvage Hearthlight. She was building her own brand in the background, preparing to cannibalize the very structure she once claimed to lead. Staff from Hearthlight were quietly being offered jobs at Ember House. Investors were being courted under promises of a next-generation hospitality model. It wasn't just betrayal. Now it was theft, a vision of community of everything we had built, and Marisa, she didn't just want to survive the lease renewals. She wanted to outmaneuver me before they ever reached my desk. But she hadn't planned on one thing. I was already several moves ahead. I wasn't angry. Not in the way Marisa probably imagined. What I felt was something colder, more focused, clarity. She wasn't just reshaping the company, she was hollowing it out to build something else, something shinier, and hoping no one noticed the bones beneath. But bones always leave shadows. I just needed the right light. That light came in the form of Sierra Voss. Sierra was the CEO of Morrow & Voss, a fast-growing hospitality group making waves for its emphasis on ethical development, community partnerships, and sustainability. We'd crossed paths years ago at an industry roundtable in Asheville. I remembered her not just for her intelligence, but for the way she listened before speaking, rare in our line of work. She had once asked me if Hearthlight would consider A regional partnership. At the time, I'd declined out of loyalty, but that loyalty had since been burned to the ground. I reached out. She responded in under an hour. "Let's talk," the message read. We met 2 days later in a quiet office above one of her group's new properties in Savannah. Sierra didn't waste time. "You're holding the land. She's holding the brand. And neither of you trusts the other." I nodded. "You're not wrong." She leaned forward. "What do you want, Eli?" It was a question I'd been asking myself too. Was it revenge? Justice? Closure? Maybe it was all of that. But mostly I wanted to protect what still mattered. The people. The culture, the work we'd done at Hearthlight before it became someone's stepping stone. "I want the buildings preserved, the staff protected, the mission restored," I said. "I'll continue owning the land. But if you're willing to acquire the properties from Hearthlight under your flag, I'll offer favorable long-term leases. At market rate, but with terms that ensure integrity." Sierra tapped a pen against the table, considering. 3 flagship properties fully stabilized with community goodwill and trained staff. That's a strong acquisition. I slid a folder across the table. Inside were operational summaries, revenue breakdowns, property valuations, and lease histories, all meticulously documented. "You'd be getting more than real estate," I said. "You'd be inheriting legacy, and a chance to rebuild it right." She didn't hesitate. "Let's get my legal team on this." While Marisa scrambled to control her crumbling house, of cards I was laying the foundation for a new structure, one that wouldn't carry her name. Patricia began coordinating with Sierra's counsel. We drafted preliminary terms and I started quietly reaching out to key Hearthlight staff, the ones who still believed in what the company had once stood for. I didn't make promises, just assurances, that if change came, they'd have a place in it. By the time Hearthlight's lease renewals were due, the counteroffer would be more than just a bill. It would be an exit strategy, for her, for the company, for everyone still stuck in the illusion that branding could replace substance. Marisa had tried to turn Hearthlight into a glossy product. I was about to remind her that under all that shine, the ground still belonged to me. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a humid Thursday in late May. Hearthlight's downtown office still had the exposed brick and minimalist furniture I'd chosen years ago, but it now felt colder, rebranded, sanitized, stripped of the warmth it once carried. I arrived early, not to be polite, but to remind myself that I wasn't walking into a confrontation. I was stepping into a transition, the final, necessary shift. Marisa arrived 10 minutes late, flanked by her consultant and a freshly hired legal advisor. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked prepared. The board members filed in, 2 of her hand-picked allies from the branding world, 1 investor rep, and an older member who had been there since our mother's tenure. I noticed he gave me a nod, subtle but meaningful. The agenda was brief. "Discussion of asset divestment strategy," read the header. In plain English, Marisa planned to sell the 3 flagship properties to offset financial strain and fund Ember House's next phase. She opened with a well-rehearsed monologue about brand recalibration and portfolio optimization. Her voice was steady, confident, rehearsed. Until I interrupted. "I assume you've notified the landlord of your intention to sell buildings on leased land?" The room went still. Marisa stiffened. "The leases are standard and renewable," she said, glancing at her legal counsel. I placed a document folder on the table, 1 for each board member. Actually, the leases are not standard. They require landlord consent for transfer of ownership and include restrictive clauses related to subletting and restructuring. Her consultant leaned forward, scanning the papers. Marisa's eyes darted across the room, landing on the investor rep whose brow furrowed as he read. "And who exactly is this landlord?" Marisa asked, trying to feign indifference. I met her gaze. "Rising Ground LLC, owned entirely by me." Silence followed, longer than anyone expected. The investor rep looked up from the lease agreements. "Is this accurate?" "It is," I replied calmly. "Fully documented, properly filed, compliant with all corporate governance procedures as confirmed by independent counsel. Marisa opened her mouth, but before she could respond, I added another folder to the stack. While we're discussing due diligence, I thought the board should also be aware of Ember House LLC, owned by Marisa under her married name. According to city planning records, Ember House has submitted permit applications for hospitality development within blocks of all 3 Hearthlight flagship properties. A murmur rippled through the boardroom. The older member flipped through the folder, then slowly turned to Marisa. "Is this true?" She hesitated. Just long enough to confirm everything. "It's a parallel vision," she said eventually, her tone sharp. "One I created to expand our market reach." "Using Hearthlight resources? Hearthlight staff, investor contacts?" I asked. The consultant spoke up. "This is a mischaracterization. The ventures are separate. Then you'll have no issue with the fact that Sierra Voss from Morrow & Voss has expressed formal interest in acquiring the 3 buildings, contingent on staff retention, community engagement, and long-term lease agreements with Rising Ground." That was the final blow. I watched Marisa's confidence crack. Her voice rose uncharacteristically sharp. "You've been planning this behind my back." "No," I said, voice steady. "I've been preparing for the moment you decided this. Company didn't need me. You fired me. You gutted our culture. You tried to steal what we built so you could turn it into something plastic." The board sat in stunned silence. Then the investor rep spoke. "Given the conflict of interest and the damage already sustained, I recommend the board reject the proposed property sales and consider leadership restructuring immediately." "I abstain," the older member said quietly, "but I second the motion." Marisa stood, but no one followed. Her shoulders were stiff, her expression unreadable. She walked out without another word. The vote passed. The company she tried to reshape without roots now had none of her vision left in its foundation. Outside the conference room, I paused by the original blueprint of the New Orleans flagship, framed on the wall. I remembered laying it out on our mother's kitchen table. Back when everything still felt possible, now it was time to build something better, something worth keeping. The deal closed in just under 6 weeks. Morrow & Voss acquired the buildings at full market value. The leases I'd offered through Rising Ground were finalized with terms that protected the staff, ensured property upkeep, and embedded language requiring community reinvestment programs in each location. No layoffs, no culture erasure, just a quiet shift back to what mattered. The Hearthlight name stayed in a limited capacity, rebranded under the Morrow collection as a heritage line, a nod to its origins. The cafes reintroduced local vendors, hired back former employees where possible, and restored the community spaces that had been stripped away under Marisa's consultant-driven overhaul. Slowly, the heart returned. Marisa resigned 2 days after the board vote. The email she sent to staff was polished and sterile, full of phrases like "new horizons" and "grateful for the journey." There was no mention of Ember House. A few weeks later, I saw an industry report noting that the LLC had quietly withdrawn its applications in Charleston and Austin. The investors she'd courted had likely seen the writing on the wall. I didn't reach out to her. I didn't need to. The silence between us was louder than any confrontation could have been. I wasn't interested in rubbing salt into wounds or winning in public. I'd already won the only way that mattered, by restoring the thing we both claimed to love, even if we loved it differently. Morrow & Voss brought me on in an advisory capacity, Director of Community and Culture Strategy, a title I chose myself. I didn't want an office or a corner desk. I preferred being in the spaces, walking through the buildings, talking to staff over morning deliveries, observing rather than commanding. It felt right, like coming home without having to announce it. One afternoon in late August, I visited the New Orleans flagship. The sun spilled through the tall windows, catching on the edges of the old brickwork. A young barista named Jasmine, who I'd once hired as a dishwasher at 17, was now running the floor. She spotted me near the back and waved with the ease of someone who belonged. I nodded, took my coffee to the courtyard, and sat quietly beneath the same fig tree we planted a decade ago during one of our community weekends. A few guests chatted nearby. One of them commented on how the place felt Different from other boutique hotels, but couldn't quite explain why. That made me smile. That feeling, the one you can't name but know in your bones, that was the work. I didn't need recognition. I didn't want headlines. I wanted the lights to stay on, the doors to stay open, and the people inside to feel like they were part of something that mattered. And now, for the first time in a long while, they did. I leaned back in my chair, let the city sounds fold around me, and allowed myself to feel something rare in the business world. Closure. In business, people often mistake noise for power. They believe the loudest person in the room is the one in control, the one with the titles, the investors, the spotlight. But real power, the kind that endures, is quiet. It's in the foundation, not the facade. Marisa thought control came from the top down. What she missed was that companies aren't held together by branding decks or mission statements printed on lobby walls. They're held together by people, by culture, by ownership in its truest form. The kind you can't fake, outsource, or polish into a marketing campaign. I didn't take revenge. I took responsibility for the business we built, for the people it touched, and for the values we let slip when no one was looking. So if you've ever felt pushed aside, underestimated, or replaced, remember this. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait, prepare, and protect the part no one else sees coming. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done differently if you were in my place? And if you believe stories like this matter, quiet victories earned justice, consider sharing or subscribing. It helps keep these conversations going right where they belong.